Hello, this is Ron Broussard, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 12, Scene Size Up. This chapter pretty much encompasses your PINMAN acronym that we're teaching you guys in lecture to use in skills throughout your patient assessment. Now, understand that EMS and a lot of these scenes are very dynamic. They're always changing, and the environment is uncontrolled. Okay, there is a lot that you guys can face when going to a call. Even if the call comes down as like a simple, generalized weakness call, you really don't know what it is that you're going to walk upon. So you have to keep your situational awareness up at all times when entering the scene. Now, if you're not able to keep that situational awareness high, hazards that you could face on scene can carry some very high costs, which include, you getting injured, possibly even fatally, especially like with traffic and roadside scenes. It doesn't take much for a distracted driver to hit you. So you always have to maintain a high situational awareness, okay? You must pay close attention to the scene on every single call. Now, safety is an ongoing process. So we teach you guys PINMAN, as soon as you come in, BSI, is my scene safe? And then you start, after that, for PINMAN, you start your patient assessment. But understand, you should have safety in your mind throughout the entire call, okay? It's not just something that you check at the beginning and then forget about. It's something that is constantly being assessed. Now, in our scene size up, we need to identify those hazards, figure out why we're called to the scene, and then also recognize any additional resources that we may need. So we use a step-by-step approach. We teach you guys PINMAN, all right? But to assess our scene, so number one is take your BSI, assess the scene for any hazards. So is my scene safe? Is my crew safe? Is my patient safe? Okay. Determine if there's any environmental hazards that are out there. Figure out, what's my mechanism of injury or nature of illness? How many patients do I have? Okay, and then what additional resources do I need? So that's all part of our step-by-step approach to sizing up the scene. Now, PPE is the equipment that you take to protect yourself, okay, from pathogens and from the environment. Okay, it can include simple nitrile exam gloves. It could also include full turnout gear and an SCBA. Okay, so you need to make sure that you're using the appropriate amount of PPE for the scene that you're on. Also, don't use any PPE that you're not trained in using. All right, make sure you're familiar with the equipment and you know how to use it. Now, when you enter a scene, make sure you're wearing the same amount of PPE as those that are around you. All right, the last thing you want to do is walk in and your ambulance uniform with the thin cotton shirt and station pants, and everybody around you is in full SCBA, turnouts or hazmat suits. Okay, if you're the odd man out, you're probably the wrong one. So make sure you're assessing the PPE of those around you and dress accordingly. Now, here's a good example of a dynamic scene where we're kind of going through, looks like an extrication process. The equipment that's being worn here, turnouts, helmet, thick leather gloves, is to protect them from the vehicle. All right, so sharp metals, broken glass, things like that. Now, the EMT over here is not dressed in that equipment. Notice he has the backboard, has the seat collar. He is ready to receive that patient. So his focus is going to be more on patient care because he doesn't have the appropriate PPE. He's not being incorporated in that call. All right, at least in the extrication portion of it. Now, scene safety is an assessment of the scene. All right, you need to make sure you're safe. You need to make sure your crew's safe. You need to make sure the patient's safe. Always make sure you're reassessing that scene just like you would reassess your patient. Okay, things can change, situations can change. A family member being in pain, could trigger those that are around them to get upset, maybe think that you're causing that pain and maybe cause some aggression towards you. So be aware of the body language of the people that are around you. Okay. Now, scene safety requires EMTs to exercise leadership and take control of the scene. When you enter that scene, don't be afraid to control it. Things like turning off the television, controlling the lights in the room. If you have a family member that's screaming and frantic, maybe have a resource, like a firefighter or your partner, try to calm that family member down, especially if it's a little kid, because you could have a parent that's, very, emotional, and that could be causing the child to become emotional. All right. So, assign a resource to that, emotional family member. Now, consider dispatch information. So, we try to get as much information as we possibly can from dispatch. All right. Dispatch is going to be receiving information from the patient or from a family member, and that can be a chaotic moment for them when they're delivering that information to 911. Dispatch is going to get as much as they possibly can, okay, from that person calling, and they're going to try to relay that information to you as best as they possibly can. Now, understand that that information can be different. I've been dispatched to literally came down as food poisoning. That's what they said we were going to. And we get there, patient's nauseous, vomiting, and we put him on a monitor, and he has, he's having a massive heart attack. So kind of completely changed the dynamic of the call and the pace of the call from what we were thinking that we were walking into. Now, some hazards that we can face on scene: angry or hostile patients or bystanders, hazardous material, infectious disease. Guys, we're dealing with the pandemic right now. Infectious disease is something that we're dealing with, like mask and eye protection, gloves. That's like enhanced our mandatory PPE on every call. Okay, crime scenes, and then down power lines. All are hazards that we face. Now, consider the need for additional or specialized resources. Now, on the ambulance, I don't have, cutters and spreaders and jacks and everything to extricate a patient from a vehicle. So I would need some special resources when dealing with that. Okay, I would need the fire department on scene. If there is a, say, power line down, I maybe want the electric company to keel power to the electrical wires before I start approaching the scene. If there is, say, a vehicle that struck a fire hydrant, maybe have the fire department cut off the water to that hydrant, or a gas leak, have the gas company come out. There's endless resources that you can think of. Okay, here we go. Down electrical wires pose a threat to the EMTs. So there's a lot going on here. Same, we talked about PPE with the previous picture, so same things happening here. All right, now we have traffic. We're on the side of the road. Law enforcement, that's a resource. They're controlling traffic. Okay, probably have the electrical company cut power to these lines, all right, before we started extricating the patient. Okay, so a lot of resources that are being utilized here. Okay, now determine scene safety again. So consider scene characteristics. Your safety is always the #1 priority. Always. We will never enter into an unsafe scene. The scene needs to be controlled prior to us going into it, because if we get hurt, ultimately we're not going to be able to provide patient care, and then anybody who comes after that is probably going to be focused on getting us rescued and then providing care to us and then the patient. So it's kind of affecting the patient in two separate ways. One, we can't treat them, and then two, the people who are going to come after that are probably going to come and treat us. Now, those resources may be diverted from the patient to us, so we need to make sure we just don't enter into an unsafe scene. Now, do not enter into an unstable crash scene, especially one where the vehicle's on its roof. Those pillars that's, create the roof, all right, are not designed to support the weight of the vehicle. So they can affect the vehicle's ability to be supported, and it can actually crash down onto the rescuer and the patient. Now, with roadways, a lot of noise going on, distracted drivers are everywhere, so that poses some hazards. So we always want to make sure that we have like law enforcement controlling the scene, maybe park the ambulance in a way that protects us, okay, and creates a barrier, and wait for police to enter the crime scene or volatile scene before you enter into it. Or if you are in that scene and it does become dangerous, withdraw yourself from the scene. Now, always make sure you bring your radio with you. because you may need it to call for help. So the last thing you want to do is need that radio and you left it back in the ambulance. Always carry your portable radio with you, call for appropriate help, okay, and then remove yourself if the scene becomes hazardous. Now, crash scenes. Hazards from crashes and from traffic must be controlled. So is the vehicle stable? All right, now if the vehicle's still in gear, okay, there is a likelihood that that vehicle can still move and then pose a hazard. So maybe we'll chalk the tires. We've already talked about if the vehicle's on its roof, we may need to provide some cribbing to support that vehicle. All right, are there any down power lines? So we do not want to get electrocuted, so we might need to cut power to those power lines. Now, of course, jagged metal, broken glass, that can pose a threat to us, and our nitrile gloves don't protect us, okay, from that metal and glass. Okay, we want to make sure we have good turnouts, thick leather gloves. Undeployed airbags can be an issue. All right, so we want to cut power to the battery. All right, so those airbags don't deploy and cause an injury to us. Okay, if fuel's leaking, there could be a risk of fire. All right, and then any hazardous material that could be involved. So we want to identify the possible risk of hazmat as far away from that scene as we possibly can. As far away from the scene as we possibly can, utilizing the UN identification numbers of safety placards, using the emergency response guidebook to try to identify the hazard and to see what it is before we enter into that scene. Okay, now to reduce the incidence of being struck by traffic, so we want to wear our approved reflective vests, limit your time on scene, reducing exposure, and then if at all possible, shut down traffic on the roadway. That's not always what we get. Sometimes we can divert traffic, around the accident. The ideal situation is we close the road and then traffic goes on another road. It's not always the circumstance though. So you try to control traffic as best as possible. Just no preferred, we'd have people driving on another road than us providing care. Okay, place flares and cones. Okay, place vehicles strategically so they protect the scene, like your ambulance, or even better, a huge fire engine. Okay, and do as much work as possible out of the flow of traffic. Now, this is a tough one. Don't turn your back on moving traffic. Well, you're going to have to turn your back on something eventually. What this is implying is just maintain that situational awareness of traffic, okay? Understand that we want to divert it away, but maintain situational awareness of the traffic around you. Don't jump highway dividers, okay? And then reduce unnecessary scene lighting that distracts or impairs visibility by traffic. Now, this is finding that happy balance, all right? But the last thing you want are spotlights, say, facing out. I'm sure everybody has probably driven by a scene where there's been a spotlight out and it shines right in your eyes and kind of blinds you, especially at night. We want to try to limit blinding traffic as much as possible, but we also want to make sure our scene is well lit for us to provide appropriate care. So it's about finding that balance there. Now, turn the wheels of the parked emergency vehicle so they're pointed away from the scene, and avoid stopping and standing between vehicles. All right. Again, if somebody hits the ambulance, it's going to move it. The last thing you want to do is get pinched in between two emergency vehicles. All right. Now, some rescue scenes require specialized training and equipment. Okay, such as this is CBRN, so chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear and explosive, that require specialized training. Height angle rescue requires, ropes, safety harnesses. Natural disasters are going to require, probably the emergency incident management system, all right, where you have like multiple resources from different agencies getting pulled in. Underground areas or confined spaces where you have a limited amount of oxygen, you're probably going to need like a CBA or supportive oxygen in order to enter into some of those areas. Okay, now collapses, cave-ins, storage tanks and vats. So storage tanks and vats, it's going to be the same thing. They could have something that's been in them that is toxic, or also it can reduce, the oxygen, just like silos and bins, also farm equipment. Now, making sure that equipment's, power is cut off to it. I'm a nurse in the ER. I see a lot of people who work with farm equipment out here, and what's sad is like they'll go to work on something and they won't kill the power to it, and they come in with amputations, their fingers or hand. We want to make sure power is cut off to that equipment before, so it doesn't get activated again and pose risk to us. Okay, now unstable surfaces and slopes. We always want to secure the patient to the hillside if possible. Okay, be sure that vehicles that have gone over embankments have been secured, because there's likelihood that they can, with us entering into them, become dislodged and then fall further down. And then be aware of loose rocks and stones that may be knocked down onto your position that then strike you. Again, this is all about just maintaining some situational awareness of your scene. All right, be aware of what's going on around you. Now, water. Now, the big thing, we'll talk about it later, is in order to perform a water rescue, okay, you need to be specifically trained in water rescue. You need to be a good swimmer. You need to have a personal flotation device. Okay, if you are not any of those things, then you shouldn't be conducting a water rescue. Now, if we do enter into a water source, okay, should be shallow enough to retrieve the patient and have a uniform bottom. All right, if it is not shallow, if it does not have a uniform bottom, at that point you should be considering specialized resources to retrieve that patient. Okay. So I got a lot of people, a lot of students in my class, I have a lot of trained, lifeguards, they've been a lifeguard for a while, and, they're becoming, EMTs to be paramedics. And they all tell me it's like, rescuing in a swimming pool is a lot different than, rescuing in a river, and I think everybody can probably agree on that. So just because you may be really good in the pool doesn't mean that it's a good idea for you to enter into that river without appropriate resources. Okay, so toxic substances in low oxygen areas. This is where we talked about hazmat spills, okay, confined spaces. Just be aware of, like, say, gases, unusual odors in the air. Another big telltale sign that the air is toxic is multiple people in the same area experiencing the same signs and symptoms. All right, so if you have multiple people that say they have a headache, or their eyes are burning, or they're having shortness of breath, with cough, those are all things that are cueing you into maybe the air is toxic where I'm at. All right, so clandestine drug operations, we're seeing this, kind of anywhere you go. No place is free from, drugs. But when you enter into these scenes, they are very volatile. All right, so if you identify that, you need to remove yourself from the scene and have appropriate resources like hazmat teams come out to control that scene prior to you making entry. Okay, now click on the item that is not a goal of the scene size up. So A, getting a sample history from the patient. B, determining whether the nature of the problem is medical or trauma. Detecting anything that could jeopardize EMT safety. Okay, and then making a decision about resources needed to manage the situation. So when you think of scene size up, I want you to think of Pinman. So me and my crew safe. Any environmental hazards? How many patients do I have? What's my mechanism of injury or nature of illness? Okay, then what additional resources do I need? So nature of the problem, okay, mechanism of injury, nature of illness, we're good there. All right, that's part of our scene size up. Detecting anything could jeopardize EMT safety, and me and my crew safe. All right, hey, that's part of the scene size up. Then making a decision about additional resources. Hey, additional resources, we need to determine that, right? So therefore, a process of elimination, getting a sample history from the patient is not part of the scene size up. I'm sure you guys probably all got that a lot faster than it took me to explain. Now, crime scenes. So crime scenes can become dangerous, can be volatile. We always want to make sure we have law enforcement controlling that scene prior to us entering into it. Okay, so wait for police arrival prior to you going in. If you have really good dispatch too, which, when I worked on the ambulance, we did, they would always have a stage prior to law enforcement making entry. So then once law enforcement made entry or made contact, scene would be cleared, dispatch would have us then enter. All right, now if you arrive at such a scene and feel uneasy, okay, don't enter the scene, contact law enforcement. Now, with crime scenes, arriving at the scene, turn off the siren and emergency lights by arriving discreetly to draw less attention. All right, there's a lot of cases that have been out there of, emergency providers, say, being fired at, all right, or being shot at as they approach a scene. Again, when you're entering into those scenes, you just don't want to draw attention to yourself. If you arrive at such scene feeling easy, okay, don't enter the scene. And if you need to, park away from the house. All right, like park around the block. Like I told you with dispatch, they'll have you stage. I've been staged blocks away from a call, prior to entering in once it's been cleared. Okay, now studying the crowd. Assess the crowd. The size of the crowd is less important than the mood. That is so important. Okay, now just because there is a large gathering of people, now, there is always that concern. I don't like being in huge crowds. Okay, but if that is a peaceful crowd, you know, I would much rather have a large, peaceful crowd than a group of like 7 or 8 people who are just like rowdy, because I'm more worried about them, causing violence towards me versus everybody who's all, getting along. All right. So don't allow yourself, though, to be pulled into that chaos. All right. That's why leadership and taking control of your scene is so important. Now, if you do feel like the crowd is becoming hostile towards you, it is okay for you to withdraw from that scene. All right. Because again, you do not want to become a patient yourself. Now, with that crime scene, this is kind of broken down in your book a little bit further. Walk on the grass, not the sidewalk. It's to limit noise. Hold your flashlight beside you, not in front of you. The idea behind it is if you're holding your flashlight in front of you, it's dark, and say that person has a firearm, you're creating a target for them to shoot at. Okay, and if you're holding that light in front of you, guess what? You're putting the target right, in the middle of you. So you hold it beside you, so if they do start shooting at you, the hope is that they're a great shot and they hit the flashlight, not you. But the hope is that they don't shoot you. Now, walk in a single file line. All right, that kind of what that does is it limits the effect, I know, of like approaching the scene. Single file line kind of creates a smaller target, but then also when you're entering the scene, it's less people that are affecting like the scene characteristics as far as an investigation goes. Now, be aware of places that you could take cover. Now, cover versus concealment. Now, military guy also, cover protects you from, direct fire, whereas concealment just conceals where your position is, okay, but it doesn't necessarily protect you from bullets, all right? So understand you may have concealment behind a wall, but that wall may not stop bullets. So if that wall doesn't stop bullets, then it's concealment. Now, if that wall can also stop bullets, it's cover. House walls, okay, concealment. All right. I need to be behind a really thick, brick wall, in order to consider that cover. Now look at windows and corners, and then stand to the side of a door when you knock. We have some pictures of this coming up. Now, on crime scenes, when you're at the patient side, your goal is to protect you and your partner. Okay. Now, don't get sucked into it being a crime scene. All right. In the fact that you may be treating the perpetrator, okay, of this crime. All right. And you're going to treat that patient with dignity and respect, just like you would treat any other patient. Now, when you enter into that scene, be aware that you may be working on somebody and the perpetrator may still be there. All right. So just, again, keep that situational awareness up. Law enforcement hopefully has that situation secured prior to you going in. All right. Now, follow your protocols ultimately at the end of the day as far as entering in on crime scenes. Like again, we would always stage off scene until law enforcement cleared the scene, and then we would enter in. Now, at a secured crime scene, we will only use the number of resources necessary to treat the patient. All right, we don't want a bunch of resources in there that are disturbing the scene and that could affect the investigation. If all I need is myself and my partner to treat this patient, that's all I'm going to bring in there. Ultimately, we don't want to allow bystanders to touch or disturb anything with the scene. All right, so again, we don't want to damage evidence. Introduce yourself to the patient. Okay. Patient may be the perpetrator. Again, that doesn't matter. Your goal is patient care when you're in there at the patient's side, so you're going to treat that patient just like you would anybody else. Okay, have an EMT keep watch on the area. Your job is to render care, and then where appropriate, assist police. Again, this is more going to be along with following your protocol there. All right, your goal on scene is patient care. Okay, don't disturb any evidence. Do not touch or move suspected weapons. Now, if you have to move a weapon because you feel like it's affecting your safety, okay, I don't care how comfortable with firearms you are, you will simply grab it by the handle and then move it away from the patient. Now, you will need to notify law enforcement where you found it and where you moved it to, and let them know that it was moved by you. Like, let's say you're treating the patient and you're cutting their clothes to assess them and a firearm falls out. All right, you're not just going to leave it like laying on the patient. You're going to move it away from the patient because you don't want them to grab it and shoot you. So grab by the handle, move it away, let law enforcement know it's like, hey, this was found on the patient. Okay, we moved it over here, or give it to law enforcement at that point. But you're not going to be like clearing out the pistol or anything like that. Again, if that's in your textbook, okay, it doesn't mean like, oh my gosh, my scene's unsafe now because there's a firearm on it. Okay, that's not, no, just move it out of the way and then provide care. Okay, wear gloves all the time. That should be an easy task for you to accomplish. Do not cut through any bullet or knife holes. Okay, do not cut or untie any rope knots. All right, do not burden the patient with crime questions. Okay, so ask questions only relevant to patient care. Know who is at the scene when you arrive, because when law enforcement's there, a lot of people will disperse. All right, but take note of who's around you. Okay, this is showing you an example of carrying the light away from your body. Okay, entering a single file line. Look at that. They're not even following their own guidance of walking on the grass. All right, knocking on the door. I think there was a case a few years ago in New York where a couple rescuers approached the scene and they knocked on the door and immediately somebody started shooting through the door. I don't remember the outcome off the top of my head. I think it was somewhere on the East Coast, but it is a real concern. All right. Now, barroom scenes. Now, alcohol and drug use can lead to unpredictability. All right. Also, in bars, generally they're not well lit. Okay. Book talks about wearing sunglasses, before, entering into a scene, like a bar room, because it helps preserve some of your, low light vision. You guys can all kind of relate to this if you've ever, like, say, woken up in the middle of the night, right? And you can kind of see your room a little bit, and then you walk into the bathroom and turn on the light and you like blind yourself, all right? And then when you go walking back to bed, you turn the light off, and when you used to be able to see at least a little bit to make your way back to your bed, all of a sudden when that light's off, it's completely pitch black now, all right? And your eyes have to adjust again. Now, the thought of wearing sunglasses, prior to entering the scene, when you're outside in the sunlight, and then when you enter the scene, you can take your sunglasses off, as it does preserve some amount of your low light vision. Okay, don't turn your back on patrons if possible, but ultimately you're just going to have to maintain some situational awareness of what's around you. Don't respond to verbal threats. Okay, now you may have people who are threatening you. If you're doing something or moving somebody and it's causing them pain, they may threaten you. Don't respond to those verbal threats, but be aware that this could be escalating and maybe I need to go ahead and see myself out of this scene and contact law enforcement. All right, car passengers. Now, park at least one car length behind the vehicle with wheels turned slightly to the left. Try to reflect your high beams off the rearview mirror, and then write down the license plate number and leave it in the ambulance. That way, if anything happens to you, they can identify, like, okay, this vehicle is what they were stopped at, so now they have somebody to look for. Okay, note the number and positions of occupants. Be alert to unseen occupants, and then have your partner open the passenger side door first. Stay behind the center post, and then if you must retreat, back the vehicle away 100 to 150 yards. Now, funny thing about this in your textbook, it mentions also carrying something like a clipboard or a bag that you could throw at the occupant's face in order to withdraw yourself. I always get a kick out of reading that in the textbook. Now, in a sense, it's all about creating a barrier. So if something does happen, you have, this distraction that you can create that can buy you a little bit of time to get away. It's entertaining to read in the book, to create something that you can throw at the occupant's face. I'm like, man, we're here providing medical care. All right, but just, if you guys read the book, which I highly recommend you do, read it in that chapter. It's pretty funny. All right, now protect the patient. Now protect the patient from the environment and attention above the bystanders. Now, if you are unable to control those factors, move the patient to the ambulance. Now, this is all about maintaining a level of privacy and dignity for the patient. It is amazing the people that come out of the woodwork when, we arrive on scene. I like to think of, like, you show up on scene, it's like you got people out there, it's like, oh, I was in my house and I heard something, so I came out and I saw you guys, and they offer absolutely no additional insight into the call or into what's happening, but they're giving you like all this information. We draw attention, but ultimately, we want to protect the patient's privacy. I love some of these communities because neighbors are really friendly, but neighbors can also be really nosy too. And I've had neighbors call up the hospital, while I've been there, and be like, I saw the ambulance pick up so and so. Can you tell me, is she okay? What's going on with her? And I'm like, who are you? It's like, oh, I'm her neighbor. I live 3 houses down. And I'm like, oh, well, I can't give you that information, and this is like follow up even after they've left the scene. So, make sure you're protecting the privacy of the patient. Okay. Now, if hazards to the bystanders cannot be eliminated, remove the bystanders from the scene. That is why it's great to have law enforcement around. Okay. Keeping the crowd out of the way can be challenging. Again, law enforcement can help you with that. All right. Something like this, it might be a challenge for you. Okay. If you're needing to provide care, you have all these people that are gathered around, there are all these resources, put some of those people to work. Put some of those people to work, have them control the scene for you. Now, controlling this thing, create a workable environment. All right, with the exception of like crime scenes, lights go on, TV goes off, like move the coffee table out of the way. Move the couch if the patient's like laying on the floor, in order for you to be able to gain access to the patient to treat them. Now, of course, if it's a crime scene, you want to, limit disturbing the environment as much as you possibly can. Okay. Now, always, always, always keep a way for you to escape. All right. Always keep a way for you to escape. Know where your exits are when you enter the scene, because if things do become dangerous, you want a way to get out of there. Pay attention to those bystanders and the body language. So if you see somebody clenching their fists, jaws clenched up, they start pacing, that might be letting you know that, hey, this person's getting a little agitated. They could be a risk to me. Okay, we want to always anticipate rather than react. Also, if you have a patient that is possibly becoming agitated, okay, the one thing, especially with drug users and things like that, the last thing you want to do is come between them and say their escape route. All right, so if you have them like in a corner, you want to make sure you position yourself in a way that leaves them an opening, because the last thing you want them to do is feel like they're trapped, because they could become violent. Now, stay calm, use tact and diplomacy. This is so important, because I feel like it's something that can get easily overlooked. People can get very task oriented, but ultimately at the end of the day, if you treat that patient with dignity and respect regardless of their situation, I've found that a lot of times it does get reciprocated. Okay. Now if you're throwing your patient attitude and you're being short with them, you could probably expect them to return the favor and start to be untactful and start to be abrasive towards you. Now, be flexible, be open-minded, be alert, and be compassionate. Okay. Now, maintain your situational awareness. Okay, remember, scene size up, it's ongoing. It's just, you don't just say pin man and then you're done. You always keep your scene characteristics in mind throughout the entire call. Now, determining the nature of the problem. Now, this is, do I have a mechanism of injury? Do I have a nature of illness? Is my patient sick or is my patient injured? Now, trauma is a physical injury caused by an external force. Medical conditions brought on by an illness. Now, we can get information from dispatch, right? That, your patient is having abdominal pain, and that's what you're called to. But do you know yet if it's medical or trauma? Get dispatched to a 35-year-old female complaining of abdominal pain. Could be medical, could be trauma. You show up on scene, that's where you're sizing things up. Looking, what do I have? Like, my patient's bleeding from an open wound. All right, trauma. Okay, versus, my patient's holding their abdomen as I'm walking up. Could be trauma still, but could also be medical. We'll have to dig into that a little bit more later on, but we're trying to get an idea of what's going on as early as possible. Now, with mechanism of injury. Now, mechanism of injury refers to how the patient was hurt. Okay, it does not always give you the chief complaint. So remember, when you're assessing your patient later, you still want to find out what's wrong with them. So if you have a patient, please respond. Here's your call. Respond to a 25-year-old male in a single vehicle traffic collision. Okay, your mechanism of injury is a traffic collision. And then you go and assess your patient and you're like, "Hey, what happened?" And they're like, "Oh, it was in a traffic collision." You still don't have a complaint of what's going on. It's like, well, what hurts? With that mechanism of injury, how did that injure you? Okay, now consider the strength, direction, and nature of forces. All right, use your mechanism of injury to develop an index of suspicion for specific injuries. When we talk about trauma, we're going to find out how, vehicle collisions based off the impact can give us a certain, injury pattern. Like a frontal vehicle collision, we're looking at the patient going into the steering wheel, so injuries to the chest, injuries to the face, injuries to the lower extremities if they go like down and under into the floorboard. Whereas like rear end injuries, like one of the common things that we could see is like a whiplash injury, injuries to like the cervical spine. So we can suspect, or have an index of suspicion based off of our MOI. All right. Consider dispatch information and then ultimately examine the scene. Look at the scene. Now, some situations should create a high index of suspicion. Now, these there's some caveats to this. Like, not all falls, are horrible falls. Like if I slip and fall in my living room, like I probably suspect minor injuries. When I get really concerned with falls from standing height or with patients on like blood thinners, okay, that's where I'm gonna have like, okay, my patient's on blood thinners and they fell from standing height. Now I'm worried about some internal bleeds, especially in their head. All right. Now, in general, falls greater than 20 feet for adults or falls greater than 2 to 3 times the height of a child, those would be falls that give me a high index of suspicion for injuries. Motor vehicle and motorcycle crashes. Now, motor vehicle collisions, if I have intrusion 12 inches into the passenger compartment or 18 inches anywhere on the vehicle, all right, those are going to be ones where I have a high index of suspicion because there's a lot of speed associated with that collision in order to cause that much intrusion. Recreational vehicle crashes, a lot of times they're like rollover type accidents, but then also like clothesline type injuries where you have a patient that gets driving a recreational vehicle and gets clotheslined by a tree branch or like a wire fence. All right, pedestrians struck by vehicles. Again, speed is your big component of that. All right, and then also like injury patterns, a down and under type pattern versus like an up and over. Like, did the patient go down and under and then get also run over by the vehicle? So you have like multiple impacts in that. You have the patient being struck by the vehicle and then going down and under, and then tires rolling over the vehicle, causing additional trauma. Same thing with the up and over. Now, explosions. There are multiple phases of explosions. All right, so that cause injuries. You have your primary injuries that you see, which is from the blast wave itself, a rapid change in pressure. All right, causes injuries to hollow cavities within the body. All right, and then you also have your secondary injuries, which get caused by the shrapnel of the explosive device itself, causing fragmentation, penetrating trauma. Okay, you have your tertiary injuries, which are caused by you becoming a projectile yourself, and then you have probably going to ruin this like quaternary injuries, which is like any toxic chemical that could be in that explosion hurting. All right, stabbings and shootings. Now with stabbings, okay, length of the object plays a large role. So finding out, hey, how big was the knife that you were stabbed with, or whatever you were stabbed by. Okay, shootings. Was it a pistol? Was it a rifle? Okay, rifles have higher velocity than pistol rounds do. Okay, so with that, velocity is important. Velocity, speed kills. All right, we're going to talk about kinetic energy a little bit later on in our trauma chapters, but speed is so important when assessing your mechanism. All right, you have a lot more cavitation that gets created with a rifle round versus a pistol round. You know, somebody gets shot with a pistol versus somebody gets shot with a hunting rifle. That hunting rifle is going to have significantly more cavitation, which can damage surrounding tissue a lot more than that pistol round can. Now, burns. Burns, like, yeah, we have damage to the skin and trauma to the skin, but like circumferential burns can create a tourniquet effect. Also, a big thing that kills our patients with burns are airway breathing compromise. So with burns, we should have a high index of suspicion that there are some critical injuries there. Talked about this a little already. Falls, distance the patient fell, greater than 20 feet. Okay, with your adult patients, surface they landed on, and then body part that impacted first. Okay, again, letting us know like what injuries we can expect to see. Motor vehicle collisions, talked about this a little bit already. Head-on or frontal collisions, injuries to the front of the body, like them going into the steering wheel. Rear end collisions, that whiplash type, like injury to the cervical spine. Side or lateral impact collisions, now they're struck on the left side, we're going to expect injuries to the left side of their body. Now, rotational impacts and rollovers. Now, the issue here, especially with rollovers, is that there are multiple impacts. So we can expect to see a large, list of injuries from this, not just like with frontal or rear end. Not only that, but airbags are generally only good for the first collision, okay, and not the subsequent multiple collisions in the rollover. Now, with these impacts, we talked about this a little bit already, deformity of the vehicle greater than 20 inches, okay, in the vehicle, or the intrusion greater than 16 inches into the passenger compartment. I think I might have misspoke on that one. I reference your textbook. Now, displacement of vehicle axle and then rollovers are significant impacts. Now, impact marks on the windshield caused by the patient's head. So we call that starring on the windshield. If you guys see that, it should be letting you know that something struck that, and it's probably not their iPhone. All right, it's probably the patient's face that hit the windshield, so we can be expecting some kind of head or facial injuries. Missing rearview mirror, collapsed steering wheel, and broken seat all should be pointing you into a significant impact. Okay, side door damage with that intrusion, cracked or smashed dashboard, deformed pedals, okay, use of restraints device or deployment of airbags. Again, pointing you to the direction of a significant impact. Now, with ejections, now anytime we have a patient that's been ejected from the vehicle, all right, that is a significant impact, even for the occupants that remained in the vehicle, because if there's enough force in that collision to eject somebody, there's probably enough force to cause injury to those inside of the vehicle. Same thing with if I have a vehicle that was in a single vehicle collision and one occupant is dead on arrival. We show up on scene and that person is gone, and the other person is, sitting outside of the car, they're breathing a little fast and they're kind of amped up, it's like, well, I'm going to assume that the force of that collision, which was enough to kill that one occupant, is definitely enough to kill the other occupant. So I need to have a high index of suspicion that there are severe injuries in my surviving patient. Okay, so looking at your intrusion here. Okay, assessing our scene. Okay, motorcycle crashes. So we want to make sure we document the type of impact and whether the patient was wearing a helmet or not. Now, in California, everybody should be wearing a helmet, but I live East Coast now. Okay, people don't wear helmets. That ultimately carries a lot lower survivability if you're in an accident with your motorcycle. Okay. Also take account like these impacts. So was it head-on impact? Was it an angular impact? Was it an ejection? Okay. Or the person laying the bike down to avoid an accident. Now, while some of this, like laying the bike down to avoid an accident, you're like, okay, well, they're avoiding an accident. Well, with laying the bike down, an injury that you can see are severe abrasions that affect like an entire side of their body, especially if they're rocking their California PPE, of like Converse cargo shorts and a t-shirt while they ride their motorcycle. If they laid their bike down and they're sliding across the asphalt, that's not going to provide any protection for their skin, and you can see severe abrasions from it. Recreational vehicles, rollovers and crush injuries are common. Severe impacts with trees, rocks, and other vehicles, and clothesline injuries. We've talked about these already. Okay, so these are things that we look for with that mechanism of injury. Penetrating trauma, talked a little bit about this also. So when you're getting this information, when you're arriving on scene, if you see a knife, take account how long that knife is. Because if a patient was like kind of sliced with a box cutter versus stabbed with a butcher knife, all right, I'm looking at the butcher knife going into body cavities, whereas the box cutter doing damage to skin and probably muscle tissue, but not penetrating into a body cavity. All right. So here's an example of expose the patient's body to confirm or rule out a stabbing or gunshot wound. The one thing when you're finding these wounds, always, always, always check for an exit wound. All right, always check for an exit wound anytime you have penetrating trauma from a shooting. Okay, or also look for additional stab wounds. Blast injuries, we talked about this. We have primary injuries caused from the pressure wave. We have secondary injuries caused by flying debris or shrapnel. Tertiary injuries, which are then caused by you becoming that projectile. And then those quaternary injuries, which are from the toxic substance that could be in that explosive device. Okay, so those are injuries that we could see with explosions. Now, determining the nature of illness, we are not there to diagnose the patient, but we are trying to get a field impression of what's going on with the patient so we can appropriately treat them. Like we all say, it's like we're not going to diagnose them, but that field impression that we can get does guide our treatments. We're learning, we're going to learn, cardiac emergencies. If my patient's having chest pain, okay, that we think is cardiac in nature, well, I administer aspirin and I assist them with nitro if they have it, right? Okay, I'm not diagnosing them with a heart attack, but I am narrowing down, what I think is going on with the nature of the problem when I later get into my assessment and treat them appropriately. So again, just don't think we're diagnosing, we're just trying to get a good field impression to better treat the patient. Okay, so to determine the nature of illness, consider the clues as you're approaching the scene. Is there medications around, drugs, alcohol? Is there like home oxygen? A lot of those patients should have placards, on their house that they have oxygen in their residence. Now, the position and condition of the patient, are they bedridden? Okay, do they have a hospital bed in their home? Okay, maybe like a hospice patient. Then the environment that you enter into, drug paraphernalia. Okay, I'm sure people have probably been into a home where they smoke. All right, and if you're a non-smoker and you enter into a home that is somebody who smokes cigarettes, it's like and you can smell it. All right, well, if you get called out to difficulty breathing and you enter into that home, all right, this patient might have a chronic lung disease. So those are all things that we're kind of taking in as we're entering into the scene. Now, determine the number of patients. So if there are multiple patients, call for additional help. If we have the ability to, we want to try to do that prior to even getting out of the ambulance. If I pull up on a scene and I see like bodies everywhere, I'm going to try to get a quick count, and get as many resources to my physician as I possibly can. All right. It's always better to, ask for the resources and not need them than to need them and not have them. All right. Worst case, they show up and then you cancel them and they have to go back. Now, I'm not saying you have, a two vehicle collision. You're like, we need 100 ambulances to my position. You're not going to do anything like that, but try to get, as close to an accurate idea of, how many patients you're going to have. Don't get sucked into, oh, you get dispatched to a single vehicle collision, and just, oh, probably 2 or 3 people. How many people can fit in a big old SUV? Well, seating's for like maybe 8 if they have the third row. I saw on the news like a crash down in like El Centro where it was a single vehicle rollover and like there were 18 people in the car. All right, so I mean, imagine getting dispatched to that. Somebody called 911. It's like, yeah, there's a one car went off the road and rolled. All right, dispatch may just send one ambulance. All right, and the fire engine and law enforcement. And then you get there and there's like 18 patients now. All right, so understand you may need to call for those additional resources. Now, when you do have more patients than resources available, we start triage. All right, we use START, so simple triage and rapid transport, kind of a quick assessment of their airway breathing, their circulation and mental status, and then we're moving on. With this triage process, we do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So we are primary triaging a patient no more than 20-30 seconds, tagging them, and then moving on to another patient to tag them so we can get patients organized in a way to quickly get them to a hospital as they need. All right, so with triage, we're doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So that concludes this lecture. Okay, what we talked about is scene size up, your pin man being the initial step of your patient assessment, and your scene size up is going to be ongoing. All right, just when you think of scene size up, think pin man. Okay, am I safe? Is my crew safe? Is my patient safe? Okay, are there any environmental hazards that can hurt me? Hey, what's my mechanism of injury, nature of illness? How many patients do I have? Did that a little out of order, but sorry. How many patients do I have? What additional resources do I need based off what I'm seeing? All right. So think Pinman with your scene size. Okay. And that concludes this lecture.